In the autumn of the year 79, in a house on the Via Stabiana in Pompeii, a private banker named Lucius Caecilius Jucundus was already dead, most likely killed 17 years earlier in the earthquake of the year 62. But upstairs, sealed inside a wooden chest, sat 153 wax tablets. Auction receipts, consumer loans, municipal contracts, taxes owed to the city itself. None of it had been settled. When the ash fell that autumn, it didn't destroy this financial record. It preserved it, mid-transaction, unedited, exactly as it stood the moment capital stopped circulating through this city forever. That distinction matters more than it sounds. Every other ancient economy we study has been filtered through centuries of erasure. Debts paid off, records discarded, buildings demolished and rebuilt. Pompeii is the one major case where that erasure simply never happened. What we're examining today isn't a story about a volcano. It's a rare, unedited financial audit of an entire Roman city, and the findings inside it are more analytically useful than almost anything else that survives from antiquity. The real story isn't what happened on that mountain, it's what the interruption accidentally let us measure. The popular image of Pompeii, reinforced by a century of tourism marketing, is a wealthy leisure town. Villas, gardens, wine, and Roman aristocrats escaping the heat of the capital. That image isn't false, it's simply incomplete, and the incompleteness is the problem. Current population estimates for Pompeii range from roughly 7,500 on the conservative end to as many as 30,000, a range specialists are still actively narrowing. What's consistent across every estimate is this: the vast majority of that population lived nowhere near the villas that define the postcard version of the city. The analytically interesting number isn't population, it's concentration. Using nothing more than the recorded floor area of excavated houses, archaeologists studying Pompeii's private architecture have identified an economic elite of roughly 50 to 100 households, out of a city of thousands controlling an estimated 40 to 50% of all private residential space. That is not the profile of a resort town. That's the profile of a stratified urban economy with a measurable, quantifiable concentration of capital at the top. And because the city was frozen rather than gradually redeveloped, we can measure that concentration directly, instead of reconstructing it from fragmentary records the way we have to for almost every other Roman city. The organizing concept for this analysis is what we're calling the frozen ledger effect, the phenomenon by which an economy interrupted mid-transaction, rather than allowed to wind down and self-erase, leaves behind a complete, unfiltered record of capital distribution at a single moment in time. Under normal conditions, economic evidence degrades continuously. Loans get repaid and the paperwork disappears. Low-value structures get demolished and replaced by more profitable ones, erasing the material record of poverty along with the buildings themselves. Pompeii's destruction inverted that process. Jucundus's outstanding loans were never collected. The price data scratched into plaster outside a Pompeian bakery, 8 asses for a household loaf of bread, roughly 2 for a smaller ration allotted to an enslaved worker, was never painted over or replaced. The half-completed renovation of a freedman's house, midway through a deliberate architectural campaign to signal elite status, was frozen exactly at that unfinished stage. The analytical value of this is significant. It means Pompeii offers economic historians something almost no other pre-modern city can: a snapshot of wealth distribution not reconstructed after the fact, but preserved as it actually existed on an ordinary day. The methodological caution this demands, and one we'll return to, is that a single frozen snapshot cannot tell us how that distribution changed over time, only what it looked like at one specific point. The primary financial source here is the Jucundus archive, 153 wax tablets, the majority dated between 52 and 62 CE. Of these, 137 are receipts from auctions Jucundus personally financed, 16 document contracts between Jucundus and the municipal government of Pompeii, evidence that private banking capital was directly integrated into civic finance, and 17 record consumer loans extended to auction buyers, typically at interest rates in the range of 4 to 12%. There was no centralized banking institution in this system. Capital allocation was a private function. Anyone holding surplus wealth could act as a lender, which meant the supply of credit was structurally tied to wherever wealth already existed, rather than distributed through any institutional mechanism. Set against that credit system, the cost of living data recovered from wall inscriptions gives us the demand side of the same economy. A household loaf of bread, roughly 8 asses. A smaller loaf, apparently rationed for enslaved labor, about 2. Olive oil, approximately 40 asses. Wine, depending on grade, 1 to 4 asses per measure. One surviving domestic budget, itemized day by day, indicates a household of 3 plus 1 enslaved worker operating on roughly 8 asses per day. A subsistence-level margin with essentially no capacity for savings or credit access. The trade data adds a further layer. Despite substantial local production of wine, olive oil, and the fermented fish sauce garum, Pompeii ran a net import surplus, functionally a trade deficit, financed by capital inflows from wealthy landowners across the broader Bay of Naples region. This was not a marginal or subsistence economy, however. Roughly 600 private shops, bars, workshops, and inns have been identified within the excavated city, and 33 bakeries alone produced an estimated combined output exceeding 2,000 loaves daily, indicating bread had become a mass-produced commercial commodity rather than a household task. The synthesizing metric is the Gini coefficient calculated from Pompeii's housing data, between 0.54 and 0.62 using house size alone, rising to between 0.72 and 0.92 in models that also account for households owning no residential property at all. Combined with the 50 to 100 household elite controlling 40 to 50% of housing stock, this constitutes one of the most granular quantitative pictures of wealth concentration available for any pre-modern economy. This structure didn't emerge in isolation. The earthquake of 62 CE inflicted serious structural damage on the city, and historical accounts describe a subsequent departure of many established aristocratic families. That departure created what a modern economist would recognize as a capital vacuum at the top of the local hierarchy, an opening for new sources of wealth to occupy positions the hereditary elite had vacated. What filled that vacuum was commercial capital rather than inherited capital. Traders, merchants, and freedmen who had accumulated wealth through commerce during a period when the formal status hierarchy still excluded them. The structural shift here is significant. The source of elite power moved from land and political office toward trade margin, while the behavioral norm remained constant. Wealth in this society had to be performed publicly, through architecture, patronage, and civic donation, in order to convert economic capital into social capital. This is a recurring pattern across economic history. Disruptive shocks tend to create windows in which new capital displaces incumbent capital. Pompeii is simply the case where we can observe the mechanism directly, rather than infer it. The system can be decomposed into 3 functional layers. First, the beneficiaries. Private bankers extracting interest and commission on every transaction they financed. Merchants controlling the wine and oil trade routes out of Pompeii's exceptionally fertile volcanic hinterland. And property owners extracting rent from the roughly 600 commercial units distributed across the city. Second, the cost bearers. Households operating on approximately 8 asses a day with no meaningful price flexibility. Enslaved laborers whose largely uncompensated work underpinned production and retail activity across the city, evidenced by consistently smaller, plainer living quarters wherever they've been excavated. And auction buyers forced into interest-bearing debt simply to participate in the market at all. Third, the structural mechanism sustaining the system. The absence of centralized banking meant capital naturally pooled wherever it already existed. The social requirement of visible wealth for civic status incentivized conspicuous consumption over broad capital reinvestment, and dependence on Mediterranean-wide trade networks tied local prosperity to macroeconomic forces entirely outside any individual resident's control. The clearest case study of mobility within this system is the House of the Veti. Aulus Vettius Restitutus and Aulus Vettius Conviva began as enslaved men, likely owned by the same household. A 2023 reassessment by Pompeii's archaeological park director revised the long-standing assumption that they were biological brothers, noting that Roman slavery typically severed family ties, making it far more probable they were unrelated individuals enslaved within the same household who built a joint fortune after manumission. As freedmen, both were legally free, but structurally barred from the highest political offices by origin alone, regardless of accumulated wealth. Their response was architectural. One of the most elaborate private houses in Pompeii, its walls covered in mythological and erotic frescoes initially interpreted by early modern excavators as evidence of unrefined taste. Subsequent scholarship has revised that interpretation substantially, reading the imagery instead as a deliberate assertion of cultural literacy, a calculated display designed to demonstrate that these two men belonged among the cultural elite, despite their origin. The economic mechanism behind their rise appears to have been the wine trade, scaled over a period likely spanning from the '62 earthquake to the eruption in '79, a multi-year compounding capital accumulation horizon. Conviva is documented as having joined the Augustales, a civic and religious body specifically reserved for wealthy freedmen barred from holding full political office, reportedly following a substantial donation to a public building project. This represents a direct conversion of private trade capital into public civic status, the maximum available form of social mobility for a freedman in this economic system. The comparative analysis here isn't about intelligence, it's about structural access, and it separates cleanly into 5 dimensions. Decision-making. Jucundus's clients used credit as a deliberate leverage mechanism, borrowing against future income to seize present opportunity. Subsistence households, by contrast, faced a purely allocative decision structure, distributing a fixed and insufficient sum across competing needs. Time horizon. The Vetti's accumulation strategy operated on a multi-year compounding basis. Daily wage households, per the surviving expense records, operated on a 5-day planning cycle. Risk management. Private lenders diversified exposure across dozens of small transactions with verified witnesses, an informal but functional risk mitigation structure. Ordinary borrowers carried single, concentrated, undiversified risk with no comparable protection. Asset ownership. The economic elite held capital in income-generating real property, workshops, wine presses, commercial space. The majority of the population, per the broader inequality estimates, likely held no productive property at all. Opportunity recognition. The Vetti identified a scalable, exportable commodity uniquely suited to local geography, and understood that converting trade capital into civic donation was the only available channel for social advancement. Recognition operating on both economic and social dimensions simultaneously. The structural conclusion. The divide measurable in Pompeii's buried architecture correlates with access to credit, ownable productive assets, and multi-year time horizons, not with differences in capability. That is a systems-level finding, not an individual one, and it is corroborated by a quantitative Gini estimate derived from physical archaeological remains, independent of any surviving textual record. Synthesizing the evidence, an unsettled private ledger recording active credit markets, a subsistence household operating meters from a fortune built on a single exportable commodity, a Gini coefficient of 0.54 to 0.62, potentially higher, calculated from house size data alone, and 2 formerly enslaved men who converted commercial capital into the highest attainable civic status available to them. The synthesis is this. Pompeii preserves, with unusual empirical precision, the same structural divide observable in modern economies, between populations with access to credit, ownable productive assets, and multi-year planning horizons, and populations whose financial existence is constrained to short-term allocation. The eruption did not create this divide. It arrested the city before the evidence of it could be revised, redeveloped, or erased, as it is in every other economy across history. A rigorous treatment of this material requires engaging its strongest counter-argument directly. The population figure underlying every inequality calculation cited here remains genuinely unresolved, ranging from roughly 7,500 to 30,000 across current scholarship. Miko Floor's analysis argues the lower bound is more consistent with the agricultural carrying capacity of Pompeii's hinterland, which would characterize the city as considerably more subsistence-constrained than the commercial hub narrative suggests. A 2025 study extends this critique further, recalculating more conservative inequality thresholds, using slave subsistence income baselines. The logic underlying this objection is methodologically sound. An inequality ratio calculated against an unresolved denominator cannot be stated with false precision, and popular treatments of Pompeii frequently do exactly that. This is an active, legitimate scholarly debate, not a marginal dissent. However, this uncertainty affects the precision of the estimate, not the existence of the underlying pattern. Even the most conservative published Gini estimate, 0.54, combined with an elite of 50 to 100 households controlling 40% or more of private housing, remains a substantial concentration of wealth by any historical standard, and this pattern is independently corroborated through separate lines of evidence: house size distribution, water access modeling, and skeletal analysis. The population debate constrains the decimal point. It does not eliminate the structural finding. Roughly two-thirds of Pompeii remains unexcavated, and ongoing archaeobotanical and ceramic supply research may refine these figures considerably, or, given the current trajectory of the debate, the range may simply narrow rather than resolve entirely. The methodological takeaway for any treatment of this material, including this one: precise, uncaveated figures for Pompeii's population or inequality level, should be treated with appropriate skepticism, since the specialists producing the underlying data are still actively contesting them. The applicable framework for personal finance follows directly from the analysis. First, produce an honest snapshot of your own financial position, a single pay period, a full month of transactions, and assess candidly which side of the credit and asset divide it places you on. Second, classify your current financial decisions as allocative or leveraged, and identify one deliberate mechanism to extend your planning horizon beyond the immediate term. Third, examine the VETI model specifically: sustained accumulation through a scalable, exportable asset, converted deliberately into durable status, not a single fortunate event, but a compounding strategy executed over years. Jucundus's records were never intended for outside review. Volcanic ash converted a private ledger into a public dataset, frozen at the precise moment capital circulation in this city ceased. That accident is the sole reason this analysis is possible. The underlying lesson is not about volcanic risk. It concerns the structural invisibility of financial inequality under ordinary conditions. No resident of Pompeii, transacting business in the Forum on an unremarkable afternoon in the year 79, could perceive their own city's wealth distribution in aggregate. It required geological catastrophe, 2 millennia, and modern quantitative analysis of buried architecture to render that distribution measurable at all. The same structural invisibility almost certainly characterizes the economy you are operating within today. The analytical question this leaves you with: what would need to be frozen? A financial statement, a neighborhood, a single ordinary transaction, to make visible, with comparable clarity, which side of that divide you currently occupy.